Wahiga Muturi on Let's Create Africa, the webinar. Today I have a very interesting lady by the name Abigael Kima. She's the host and producer of Hali Hewa podcast and a good friend and a very young friend, I must admit. So please, it's not that I'm that old, but man, I mean, she's pretty young and she's accomplished so much within her age group. So as we get into this, karibuni sana, let's get on to it. All right, karibuni sana, karibuni sana. I'm happy to have all of you here. Yours truly, Wahiga Muturi, and this is Let's Create Africa webinar where we talk about business innovation, governance, and the SDGs. And today we have Abigail Kima, host and producer Hali Hewa podcast, among many other achievements, I must admit. Abby, can you hear her as well? Okay, as she's coming through, I would just like to say thank you so much for those who have been tuning in all through the seasons and the days. We are also thankful to our partners, KYR Africa, which is a civic and civil society engagement platform, and it's about education, educating you on your rights. We also have Startinet, which is an ecosystems enabler, innovations ecosystems enabler. We have the Future of Work, which is about exploring job opportunities. And we have yours truly again, Let's Create Africa. Now, Let's Create Africa is an entrepreneur support organization that is about leveraging PR, communications, media, and advocacy to allow people to get opportunities to the bottom of the pyramid. And even with that, I must admit, for those who have joined us today, we would like to hear more from you, even as we talk with Abigail Kima, very well accomplished and very well standing out young lady altogether through and through. Thank you, Abby, for joining us today, and thank you for being our guest for today. For those who don't know Abigail Kima, as I said, is the host and lead of the podcast that is Hali Hewa. Abby, can you hear us now? Hello, Abby? Okay, seems there's a technical issue with Abby. So as we get onto that, I would like to say thank you to you all for joining us. Please feel free to send us a message via our channels anywhere. Let's Create Africa or Wahiga Muturi. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Abigail Kima, have you been able to join us? We're waiting to hear. Great, you are here. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. And it's about time. So, Abby, I mean, I can say everything and people are posing just waiting for you. Please introduce yourself and tell people who you are and what you're about.
Africa Climate Summit, so I hope we will be prepared. There's a feeling as if we are not fully prepared, but I
Hello,
just
Abby?
want to maybe first to inform you again. I think you also Gillian's email.
Okay. Now we can hear you. We couldn't hear you before. We were hearing somebody else.
The connection issues. Thank you so much for having me. I only added connection problems, and I hope you will understand. My name is Abigail Kima. I am a climate and energy advocate, renewable energy advocate from Kenya, and I host and produce a climate and energy policy podcast called Hali Hewa, which basically seeks to amplify African climate voices and also shape Africa's narrative when it comes to climate and energy policy. And I'm really honored to be on your platform today. Yes, thank you.
Asante sana, the honor is all mine. Abby, What exactly do you do? I mean, you've quite a mouthful. Energy, climate change, all the buzzwords that most of the times we're hearing, but what exactly is it?
So my background is in environmental science, and I have always been in the climate and energy policy space. So what my work entails basically is around research and of course uh, issues to do with climate justice, issues to do with adaptation, mitigation, and working very closely with communities to make sure that they understand what climate change is, and to also make sure that they understand exactly what they need to do in order to mitigate and adapt to further impacts of climate change. So I at the moment I do the podcast full time, so really helping organizations and to simplify the climate language in a way that they can easily digest and understand, uh, because I notice there's usually a very huge disparity between the people who are in the space and the communities that actually need this information. So I really try my best to bridge this gap to make sure that people understand what climate change is in a very simplified way and know exactly what they can do to mitigate further impacts of climate change. Yes.
Good. So for my audience, for those who know and those who don't know, what exactly is climate change?
So climate change is basically changes in the in weather patterns over a long period of time. So climate change didn't necessarily happen at once. It happened over a long period of time, and this is thanks to industrialization from countries in the western regions, and of course now the impacts are felt most here in Africa, and that is presented in form of floods, in form of um, droughts, and of course if you're based in Kenya, you know how the northern part of Kenya has been experiencing drought for a long time. And also just being in Nairobi, you see a lot of us now are buying heaters during cold seasons. So it's basically I'd say changes in weather patterns that we were never used to, and the impacts are only felt over a long period of time. And when we are speaking about climate change and climate justice, Africa is only responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions. But when it comes to the impacts, we feel it the most. And also in terms of us being able to recover from climate disasters takes us a long time. So in terms of capacity, resources, and you've seen cyclones in Mozambique, you've seen how Nairobi floods during long periods of rain, you've seen, communities needing food relief, which is something that we thought was in the past, and it's becoming worse every other day. So that's how I would describe climate change.
So for those who are saying climate change is not real, because when you talk about food, they might be saying, well, it's the government that's not planning itself properly or planning urbanization and the likes properly. What can you tell them?
Um, Sorry, do you mind? I didn't hear. Do you mind repeating that?
No. I don't mind repeating. You can hear me well?
Yes.
Good. I'm asking for those who are wondering, but why would you say climate change is real? We don't think it's real because something like food shortage, lack of food distribution, changing weather patterns can be more blamed on how the government is planning where resources should be or should not be rather than climate change itself. What
Yeah.
can you tell them about that?
I think at this point, honestly, science has proven enough times that climate change is actually real. And there's a whole department called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that gives assessment reports. And we have since the 90s, and the latest one is the sixth report, which shows, the impacts of climate change, looking at of course, climate would have changed anyway, but there's the anthropogenic impacts, which is human influence, that is, making the impacts of climate change felt even more. So I think I would say everyone who probably lives in Africa or you watch the news, you can definitely see there's a lot of changes happening. Wildfires in countries like Canada. I think, I don't know, there's an island, Maui, that was in flames about a week ago, and these are things that never used to happen. So I think science can tell us, and also our lived experiences can actually tell us that climate change is real.
Interesting. So what led you to this path, being a climate change activist and the likes? What led you to this path? Because you weren't born into this. You
Yes.
woke up one day and realized, let me do this. What are the few things that have led you onto this journey?
Um, so of course, coming from um, Kenya, I live in, well, I was born in Iten, the home of champions, and of course, we practice agriculture as a main source of livelihood. And of course, we do run as well, but really, I grew up in a farm, and you would see your parents selling maize or taking maize to school, because in some schools where I come from, you can actually take farm produce in place of tuition fees. So, of course, over the years, living very close to a forest, seeing the deforestation happening, and then now seeing, initially you would, in January, it's the hottest month, and then, February towards the end, you're already starting to prepare your land. But then I also realized over the years that, it's changing. Like now, the weather patterns are so unpredictable. And what that does is that it actually impacts income in households, like farmers constantly losing their crops either to floods or to lack of rain. And I think that is felt all across Kenya at the moment. And so for me, seeing those impacts affecting my family or myself, at least in my community, I thought, why not do something about it in terms of course, going to school to study environmental science with a focus on conservation, but also now having understood the policy space when it comes to climate and energy, really wanting to do something about it. And that's why I decided to do comms, which would now help to really simplify this information. And of course, I know a podcast doesn't really get to the grassroots, but with the audience that I have, at least they have an opportunity to understand that this is what is happening and this is what I can do about it. And so the ripple effect is felt, within their communities, within their areas. So what really inspired me was that personal experience and wanting to really bridge that information gap.
Ah, brilliant. Because then the question also is, why exactly do you think your work is important in the country, in Kenya specifically, and Africa as a whole?
I think it's very evident now that climate change is affecting every one of us, and even our president at the moment is very vocal about the impacts of climate change and what could possibly be done. And really understanding the importance of the impacts of climate change in our own economy, because agriculture accounts for about 20% of the GDP. And so seeing that Africa or even Kenya is dependent on red agriculture, it's really important to make sure that we take the necessary steps to make sure that it doesn't end up affecting the things that hold us as a country, the backbone of the country. And of course,
Mhm.
the impact of climate change cuts across brings very many issues, including food insecurity, including climate disasters, which now climate mobility or climate immigration is becoming a big deal. So really understanding that climate change is cross-cutting and affects every aspect of our lives, and thus everyone is a stakeholder and has a role to play in making sure that you're doing something little to create that change that you want to see. Of course, there is the action on the ground, but there's also the policy side that makes sure things move as fast as they should, especially when it comes to the conversation on climate justice.
Nice, nice, nice. What would you say are the biggest climate justice challenges affecting Kenya and then Africa?
Um, so, as I mentioned earlier, remember we account for less than 4% of the global emissions. And as a country, as a continent, we still want to develop. We still want to, explore fossil fuels if we could, because clearly everyone else has developed with fossil fuels. And so the conversations on climate justice usually, so if we're keeping our fossil fuels on the ground, because fossil fuels, of course, are the biggest contributor to climate change, then who pays for that? Who pays for the our resources that are on the ground? Because we know we have already seen what climate change can do to us with very little contribution. So what if we explore our own resources? Then that would mean complete disaster. But then we're saying we want to keep it on the ground, but we want to make sure that there's someone that actually pays for it. And so the challenge is usually to actually access the finance and to make people commit to giving that finance that goes to adaptation, which is basically, adapting to the new normal, and then mitigation, which is preventing further impacts of climate change. And of course, now there's a whole new conversation on loss and damages, which is those rich countries paying for the damages they have caused. So if you lost your house to floods, it presents itself in form of reparations, but the conversation is even more complex in terms of where the finance is coming from, who is accessing, are they going through, and then of course the challenge is that most countries don't want to take responsibility for their actions. So that's why now there's a whole new conversation on restructuring the finance system to make sure that we that are less responsible actually transition and choose a different path of a greener pathway, which is different from what Western countries went. Yeah.
Yeah, you've actually brought in a very good point, because when it comes to loss and damage, the conversation that actually began at COP27 last year, the question still is, why would Africa be demanding for this? And why would we be asking for money and we're the ones causing the problem by ourselves? Or are we even really the ones causing the problem? And should we actually be given the money? And why can't the money, as His Excellency President William Samoei Ruto asked, Kenyan president asked, why can't Africa tackle this themselves as the AU or other organizations that come, multilateral parties that can come together and sort this?
Sorry. Just
You missed it.
the last part.
Which part did you miss?
So the question, what would you like?
Okay, so when it comes to loss and damage, why does Africa think they should be at the table asking for money? We have our president, His Excellency William Samoei Ruto, who actually stated, the AU can do this themselves if Africans and each country came together to chip in. We can also do this ourselves. So why do we still think we have the right to say we need to be either compensated or paid, etc., by the external countries?
Yeah. So it still brings me back to the question or the conversation on climate justice. Responsibility. I don't know if you. I know we all remember polluter pay principle, and we probably studied that in school. So
No. Please explain it. Not everybody was in the same school.
okay. So the polluter pays for the pollution they have caused, and that's what we are. That's basically the conversation when it comes to climate justice. Like, you contributed 30%, I've contributed 4%. So why should I pay the same amount as you? And I have explained, the whole concept of climate justice, our responsibility, and the fact that we are the hardest hit because of where we are located, and also our financial capacity to bounce back after a climate disaster. And so, of course, with the new president, he has a very different outlook to things, which is welcome. And of course, clearly the financial structures that are present have not worked. So accessing climate finance is almost impossible sometimes because of the long process. And so I guess he's coming in for a new frame to see that, okay, clearly, if we are the ones asking for money all the time, it's not coming, then how about we restructure and have a whole new fund which allows us to contribute equally? And then from then we have the ability to, ask and make decisions, because the challenge with us being Africans is that most of the time we're on the victim side, always begging. And so nobody wants to listen to us. But then with the new president, he's trying to bring in the frame of we are equals, we can contribute to. And then, when you contribute, you also have a stake and you have a stake. So I guess that is the new mind that he's bringing. And let's see how it goes.
Okay, good to note. Looking at it then, we see most marginalized community actually really affected by climate change. So how are these challenges disproportionately impacting marginalized communities, and who are the marginalized communities you can mention?
I'd say the marginalized communities that the conversations that we normally have is the fact that women and children are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. So for one, our cultural structures, women are the custodians of the land. Women are the ones basically taking care of the families. So when you go to places like I traveled to Isiolo last year when I was doing a story gathering project, and of course that particular community had been devastated by the impacts of climate change, and that was drought. So they had not seen rain for maybe a year and a half, and so that meant losing their livestock. So we would literally drive down a road littered with animal carcasses. And so when you go to these families and interviewing them and finding out what the experience is like, you find that it's just the woman and the children, and now maybe the two cows or goats have left when they used to have about 50 herds of cattle. And so something interesting that they talked about was that I had never really thought about was the fact that when this happens to them, it means, the man of the house has to migrate and look for, pasture. And in one situation, they were sharing the food themselves and their animals. And so you see, the women are the ones who are left at home trying to figure things out, because now, if you all sit down and wait, no one is coming to save you. When you look at them needing to fetch water for the family, they had to travel a long distance to get to the water point, and we even took them there. And I was wondering, how can we possibly survive in this situation? So you see, I'm not saying men are not affected, but in that situation, there are those disproportionate impacts of climate change that clearly come out in those situations. And um, so looking at Africa, there are definitely communities or countries that are more vulnerable, especially the small island states, because some of the countries are actually about to be submerged, like with the constant cyclones happening, with the constant sea level rise. There are countries that are more vulnerable than others, but also in the policy space and in the conversations, you will find that there are specific groupings. So you'll find small island states being in their own group, you'll find developed countries in their own groups, you'll find developing countries in their own groups, and then you will find they're called so people that think alike, I'm forgetting the name. So you'll find all these groupings are coming together because there's something that is common to them, and there's how the impacts of climate change is disproportionately affecting them. And so I can't say it's one group. It could be very many people, but just different circumstances. What determines whether they're marginalized or vulnerable to the impact of change.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you guys for joining us today. Please remember to send in your comments, opinions, critiques via Let's Create Africa on any social media platform, or to Wahiga Kemuturi, that is I. Thank you so much, Brian Derito, Arik Karani, for joining us. And thank you, Jogona. Thank you, Mercy. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Ivy. Oh, wow. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I see some questions which are very interesting. But before I even get to that, when we are talking about climate injustice, what exactly is that? Minus it being a hype word, what is climate injustice?
That's a very interesting question. Climate injustice.
And please, because you're in communications, break it down for the people. Make it as basic as possible.
I would say climate justice presents, or injustice presents itself in very many ways, very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
It's okay. We can hear you. Okay. Assume you're coming back. As we are waiting for her, thank you so much for those who have joined in, to continuing with this conversation, even as we await for Abigail to sort of technical hitches. Thank you, everybody. Omondi Otieno, thank you for joining. And thank you for loving the conversation. I'm really happy to have you guys just come on board. Immediately, Abby comes on board again. I'll definitely tell her that all of you would like to engage her. Thank you so much. Please remember, you can join us on either YouTube, Facebook, which is Let's Create Africa on YouTube, Facebook. That will also be LinkedIn, also Twitter. let us hear from you. I would really like to hear some comments from all of you so that I can get to know what exactly are the conversations you'd like to have with Abby. For those who don't know Abby, or rather Abigail Kima, because it's her friends who call her Abby. Please don't use it against me. For those who don't know Abigail, Abigail is the host and producer of the Hali Hewa podcast. And we're thankful for all of you who decided to join us today. Abigail Kima is actually 24 years old and again, host and producer of the podcast Hali Hewa, which means climate in Swahili, as well as climate justice. She's also a climate justice activist and energy expert. She studied environmental science at Kenyatta University, where she became the chair of the Environmental Society and won a scholarship to the University of Hungary. So please, thank you, Eric. I love your questions. I love your questions. Guys, please send in your questions, send in your opinions and comments. Immediately Abby comes back. These are the things we need to talk about because everybody wants to talk about climate change, but not only are most people unaware of what that is, most people are wondering if the conversation is also relevant. So please, as we await for her, I would like to continue seeing your messages and I'll address them one by one, even as she joins in. So I see a message from Jerry. Thank you for joining us, Jerry. I'm really looking forward to this very great conversation with Abigail. Thank you, Jerry, for that. I see Stefan. Stefan, you say, Wahiga, my question is still, is climate change real? We actually addressed that immediately we began our conversation today. And please tell your friends that we are live on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook on Let's Create Africa, the channel. So please let me hear from them as we wait for Abby. And I would like to give thanks to some of our partners. That would be KYR Africa, which is a civic and citizen education platform that has been there for the last 2 years, just helping people know their rights and have the right conversations in the right place, especially in regard to their rights. For those who also saw how Maandamano happened, most of the conversations that also happened generally definitely happened on KYR Africa. Also, I would like to thank the Future of Work, which is a jobs and opportunity platform. We are looking forward to also continue working with them. I also am thankful for Startinet, which is an innovations ecosystem enabler, and Let's Create Africa. Let's Create Africa is an entrepreneur support organization that leverages on PR, communications, media, and advocacy to bridge opportunities to people at the bottom of the pyramid. Wow, lovely guys, lovely guys. I see your conversation. I see your questions. Abigail is trying to rejoin us, so let's give her just a few minutes as she's trying to come back. I think it was just a technical hitch, especially considering where she is. And maybe we need, this is our next conversation, how to standardize internet across Africa, because also many people have been unable to connect to the necessary resources because I mean, internet is cut down in Uganda because of elections. What do you do? Sophie Kilusu, thank you. Thank you for coming by. Oh, it's a building conversation. Thanks, Wahiga. Asante sana. We are happy to have people like you here. And even the ones who have sent in their questions, please just hold on for a few minutes. Abby is trying to rejoin, even as we have this conversation. But I would like to see some more questions also. I can start with Brian DeRito, who's asking, erratic weather changes, isn't it? And Brian, I would like to know, is that a question or there was a conversation around that? Are you asking if climate change is just about weather changes or not? So we would like also to hear from you. So please tell us more about that. Arik Karani, thank you. Very interesting conversation, Wahiga. Thank you for highlighting this. I'm happy to hear that, Arik. Actually, I would like to even ask you, Karani, why what about this highlight has been important for you? Because it would also be good to know what exactly has made you tune in when we're talking about climate change and the many events, I must admit, that will be happening in the course of this month and next month, starting with the Africa Climate Summit, which will be ushered and hosted by our president, His Excellency Dr. William Samoei Ruto. Let's see who else. Omondi Otieno, you're saying I'm following this Wahika, and I love the conversation. Asante sana. You'd want to engage Abigail for TV interview? Yes, I will share her contacts with all of you. Actually, immediately she comes back, she can share that, and I appreciate. I see Bob McCary, who's talking about, I love the interview, the impact of climate change. I'm working on something to do with climate. I hope to learn from this podcast. It would be nice to know what you're working on and if it's anything we can help you with. But simply, for those who don't know, and for those who know, Abigail Kima has been the one joining us today. And we are actually waiting for her. So please type in those questions even as we await to hear from you. And in matters climate change in Africa, what is a concern that is important to you? What matters to you? What doesn't matter? Where does it make sense? Where does it not make sense? For those who don't know, Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents to climate change. The continent is already experiencing the effects of climate change, such as extreme weather, actually more extreme weather. I mean, we might have had extreme weather here and there, but now it's more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and desertification. These effects are having a devastating impact on people's lives and livelihoods. For those who missed out on our previous conversation also on climate change with Dorcas, you can find that also on our link. Let's Create Africa. Please subscribe to our YouTube page, YouTube channel. Let's Create Africa. That's LETSCREATE Africa. If you're African, please, I hope you can spell that. So it would be nice to hear from you. And so these effects are having a devastating impact on people's lives and livelihoods. And as you all know, livelihoods is extremely of concern to most of us, including no matter the level of education, no matter the level of career, no matter the level of income that you have, this is a key concern. So more extreme weather events. We've seen a lot of frequent and intense droughts, floods and storms. And these events are destroying crops, homes and infrastructure, and displacing people. Case in point, in 2022, a severe drought in East Africa caused widespread food shortages and left millions of people at risk of famine. Now, I think most of you saw that, and it was even covered on various mainstream stations. There's also rising sea levels. Rising sea levels are threatening coastal communities in Africa. In some places, sea levels have risen up by up to 2 meters in the past few decades. This is displacing people and destroying coastal systems and coastal ecosystems. So for people who love Mombasa in Kenya, I mean, there have been changes, even as reported by the marine biologists. For example, again, in 2020, a storm surge caused by rising sea levels destroyed thousands of homes in Mozambique. And that says a lot, even while most conversation is not being had. And then desertification. For those who think that the whole of Africa is a desert, it's not. So desertification is the process of land becoming dry and barren, caused by a combination of factors, including climate change, overgrazing, and deforestation. Now, desertification is a major problem in Africa, and it is displacing people and making it difficult to grow food. For example, in 2021, a severe drought in Niger caused widespread crop failures and left millions of people at risk of hunger. Now, the effect of climate change has already been felt, and it is still being felt. So, how do we do this? And what are some of the ways to address climate change in Africa? All right, so let me hear from all of you who are looking forward to hear from Abby, even as you're waiting for her. And we are going on a short break as we await for her. Thank you. Let me see the question. Thank you. All right, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. So let's go through these questions, and hopefully by then she'll be back. Let's see, let's see, let's see. So from Arik Karani, my question to Abigail would be, what can we do in our individual capacities to take necessary steps to stop the climate change crisis being witnessed globally? Thank you for that. Another question to Abigail. The dams being built across the country, are they part of the problem or climate change being witnessed in Kenya? Woo, that's a tough topic, political to say the least. Let me see another question from Maitha, who says, what is stopping East Africa through the East African community to band together to tackle climate change and climate injustice collectively? Interesting. Let me see another one. Climate financing. Randerito, you're asking, would Abigail touch on climate financing? Please. Well, I could also touch on that before she comes in, even as I wait to hear from her. Arik Karani, you also asked, I tuned into the conversation because I'm a peer practitioner and I have not been engaged fully so that I can be a champion for climate change. Thank you for that, sir. I want to make a difference. I just don't know how to. Good. Karani, we actually talked last week, I think, or last week but one about, no, it's actually last week but one and the week before. We were talking about communicating for climate change. And a quick summary of that is that we were talking about creating, engaging, and call to action. Most of the things that people miss out on is not only don't climate activists have lackluster content, they need to be more creative. And they need to use not only creatives, but even communicators to talk about and create content around climate change. That makes sense, that is shareable, and that is also relevant to them. And that's why lives and livelihoods matter to people. When it comes to engagement, there are different forms of engagement, from podcasting, which is what Abigail does, to video conferencing, for example, within different rooms, within different areas. There's also documentation, and that is a lot of storytelling going around it, both internally and externally. And then, and that's not even last but not least, because there are many conversations around how to bring meaningful and engaging content. But last but not least would be also call to action. Most of the times when we talk about climate change, there is no conversation about call to action. So yes, you've given us the information, but what do you want us to do with it? Yeah, and then I hope I've also answered that question for you also as a communicator. Good. Now, let me see other questions we can answer here. What are some of the things that we can do to address climate change in Africa? Well, we can start with, again, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that means a lot of things to different people. So it's also a different conversation. But this can be done by switching to renewable energy sources, that's solar, biogas, and the likes, improving energy efficiency. If you're not using it, just switch it off. I mean, it sounds like common sense, but it's not. And reducing deforestation. Mao Forest is a good example. Political, but it's necessary. The deforestation is reduced within the different forests that we have. Again, we also have adapting to the effects of climate change. This includes building seawalls to protect coastal communities from rising sea levels and developing drought-resistant crops. This hasn't happened a lot, especially in Kenya, because also sea level is different across the continent. And last but not least, providing financial assistance to people affected by climate change, which is also a political issue and something that came up in COP27. This can help rebuild their homes and businesses, and help them actually get back on their feet. Yeah. Brian, I think I want to answer a question for you on, let me see this. Let me see. Was this Brian? Yes, it was Brian. Climate financing. Now, there are a number of sources of climate financing for Africa, including international climate finance. And this is funding from multilateral institutions such as Green Climate Fund, GCF, and the Adaptation Fund, as well as bilateral, how do we call them? Bilateral funding from developed countries. Then there's also national climate finance. This includes financing from African governments. There's a lot of that going on actually with the AU, as well as from the private sector and civil society, that is KCDF, Kenya Climate Development Fund, if I'm not wrong, and other green organizations, PACJA, for example, Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance. Then debt relief. This includes debt relief from developed countries to African countries, which can free up resources for climate action. Yeah, but there are also disadvantages a bit. There's this finance, there's really a high cost of climate action, I must admit. And then there's a lack of capacity. Not many people in many African countries are concerned or are part of fighting climate change. And then there's a lack of transparency. So from Abby's request, as I can see, she's been unable to come on. She's been technically challenged from wherever she is. She's in, oh no, let me not name the country, but she's promised to do this again. So I would like to excuse her. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but I would like to let her be until she can sort her situation. But she'll be back, and we would like to continue with this conversation. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for climate change and the upcoming summits with Abigail Kima, who will be coming back again. My name is Wahiga K. Muturi, and I've been your host for this evening. I am thankful to have this conversation, but because it wasn't my conversation, I will wait for Abby and she'll be back. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. God bless you. Thank you.